Welcome to Darshan Talks, powered by the Kulkarni law firm. This podcast explores the challenges and opportunities facing FDA-regulated companies. Join us as we discuss the latest trends, news, and insights with experts and executives.
Hey everyone,
field.
welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I am here with Ish. Ish is going to introduce himself, but we've had Ish on before. We are going to land up talking, hopefully, depending on how this conversation goes, on the Sunshine Act and its implications on clinical trials and how companies deal with it, think about it, etc. But before we get started, Ish, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Istvan Fekete. Everybody pretty much calls me Ish. I'm a director at Huron Consulting, and I work with clients across the country on their research contracting needs.
Oh, well, thanks for coming on. Ish, we appreciate it. So, Ish, we want to talk a little bit about your experiences just to set the stage. You primarily represent sponsors, or do you represent CROs?
Neither. I represent the universities and academic medical centers who perform the clinical trials.
There you go. Okay. So you come at it from the site perspective. So you have to have had a lot of horror stories about how the Sunshine Act plays out. So do you want to start off by giving people a little bit of an introduction on what the Sunshine Act is? I mean, at this point, I'm guessing most people have heard about it, but nevertheless, what it is, why should people care about it, and how does it implicate clinical trial agreements?
Sure. So the idea behind the Sunshine Act is that when pharmaceutical companies pay physicians, they have to disclose, the pharmaceutical company that is, to CMS, the Center for Medicaid, that they have made such a payment to the doctor. Then that information is published, and the idea is the public can look at what pharmaceutical companies are paying their doctors. And when it first came out, there was a lot of confusion among the physicians in terms of what is actually considered reportable under the Sunshine Act, because it's not just money. For instance, if a physician participates in a sponsor's multi-site publication, and that physician is going to be an author on it, and the pharmaceutical company provides a biostatistician to help with that publication, that is considered a transfer of value under the Sunshine Act and reportable to CMS. And so there's this, large breadth of things outside of monetary payments that are also reportable under it. And I remember a lot of heartburn on some physicians' ends when this first got rolled out, in terms of, what kind of perceptions this would create about them having this information reported.
So that really does raise the importance of the Sunshine Act. And one of the things, you and I started talking about this yesterday-ish. It was just a different conversation. The context was different, but we literally stopped ourselves because we were like, we got to save this for the podcast. But you think, from your perspective, that the Physician Payment Sunshine Act actually has value? Your position, appropriately so, just like most people.
I would say it would have value if I would ever look at the list for my doctor. Maybe then it would have value, But I've never looked at it for any physician that I have.
And that's exactly my point. I feel like it's a good idea. It's an expensive idea. And if people actually did what they're talking about, which is looked at their doctors, looked at payments, and determined that those payments were either good, bad, indifferent, it would have significant value. My experience, however, is exactly like yours. I don't choose my doctor based on payments by pharmaceutical companies or by medical device companies. If anything, if I found out that my doctor was being paid by a pharmaceutical company for research, that might raise my perspective of how I see a doctor, which is the exact opposite, I think, of what lawmakers had in mind when they were thinking about what should be reportable and what should not be reportable. So my first question to you is, you work with large academic medical centers. Has there been you mentioned this initial pushback. Has there been a change in perspective, a almost diametrically different realization of what the reality is versus what the reality could have been?
I think from the academic medical center side, I think that there was a realization that there was a lot more alarm in the beginning than there really needed to be in terms of the impact it would have on physicians' reputations, with this information getting reported, right? I think that was the initial pushback from the physicians, but like we're talking about, that hasn't been the impact. So they've kind of relaxed their stance. And I also think from the pharmaceutical side, there in the beginning, there was this lack of understanding that they are not paying the physicians, that the physician's salary is the physician's salary and the institution is going to pay it independent of the clinical trial. And the clinical trial, that money is going to be there regardless. And so there was this conversation that needed to be had about, you're paying a covered entity under the Sunshine Act, but it's the hospital. You're not paying the physician directly. And so now what pharmaceutical companies is they understand that, and they'll say that the payment went to the hospital and just list who the physician was. So there was kind of a shifting on both sides since the law got rolled out.
So, which is kind of interesting to me, right? Because the one question I have, I have several questions already ready, but the one thing I'm thinking about is one of the provisions of the Sunshine Act was this idea that you can challenge the pharmaceutical company if the payment is misattributed. I don't know of too many situations where that happens on a routine basis. Has that been your experience, or do you find physicians going, that's the wrong payment, it should not be attributed to me, it should be attributed to the hospital, or if it is attributed to me, I don't actually care, or it's misattributed to research when it should be attributed to, or it's misattributed to advertising when it should be attributed to research, etc. Like, are you seeing any of that? Are you reporting any of that? Are you challenging any of that?
I have not heard of a single instance in my career where a principal investigator officially challenged something that was reported under the Sunshine Act. Now, of course, that's not to say that hasn't happened in my world, with the physicians I'm interacting with. But never once have I heard of a situation where they've officially challenged what was reported under the Sunshine Act. I think in the beginning, there were challenges in terms of saying to the pharmaceutical companies that that's not a transfer of value. And then the pharmaceutical company saying, no, physician, it actually is. And I do have to report it under the Sunshine Act. So I think in the beginning, there was some of that more so than like officially challenging it under the law. But since that kind of initial push, I haven't heard of any challenges.
Which really asks the next question, which is, if there was this maturation in thought processes, let's ask the really basic question: does the Sunshine Act matter? You and I both admitted we don't actually use it to look at our doctors. Let's assume someone does, but my experience is it's more watchdogs than actual patients. The cost associated with it, considering the number of pharmaceutical companies, is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not the billions, based on the last report I saw from CMS when they were proposing this. So it's an expensive program, and I'm not clear about the ROI. What is your take based on actually dealing with these physicians and the cost and the effort it takes to put it all together?
That's a great question. And, I think you could say that about a lot of compliance programs, that, a lot of them are in place for perception as much as any tangible benefit that, that we're really getting out of it. And so, are patients really looking at this and using this information? No. And so from that perspective, you have to question the ROI. But on the other hand, would I say, the ROI is so low that it's not worth it? I don't know if I would go that far, because you can see the logic behind why the law was passed, initially. So it's a great question. And yeah, I think I land on the side of, why do we argue about intellectual property in every clinical trial agreement when sites file 0 patents on industry-sponsored clinical trials that they conduct, right? I think about it kind of the same way as maybe it has some legs on it, to protect us somewhat. But yeah, I think you do have to question it, because the patient who is intended to be the primary beneficiary is very unlikely to use the information.
Which really brings us to that next question of who is the primary beneficiary? And my experience talking to sites, talking to lawmakers, is that the actual beneficiary are other sponsors who are looking at this data going, oh, my competitor is paying Dr. ABC to participate in their research. We're planning to do another study. Let's make sure we keep Dr. ABC in our research program as well, because we know he's valuable to them. Let's make sure we don't lose him in the shuffle. Alternatively, the other group is the Department of Justice and the Office of Inspector General, because you're seeing now, and I see this, I seem to monitor the DOJ, OIG information portals, if you will, on a consistent basis, and you're seeing a lot of claims under the False Claims Act and under the anti-kickback policies, where you're seeing these payments were being made to these doctors, and now people are prosecuting based on that. And chances are it would have just been more difficult for lawmakers to find out this information if it wasn't so readily available on the website. So now you're required to make that information readily available, and when it's readily available, someone can literally just go onto it and get the information. But I guess my reaction to this whole thing would be, if the intended beneficiary was, let's assume that the intended beneficiary was not competitors, because that just seems weird. But if it was regulators, I think that was the achieved goal. In which case, this was all a new system to just create more taxation, as opposed to actually impact and lower drug costs. What is your thought process?
I can't really disagree with that. I would agree with what you just said. And I think, my wife has MS. And so when she was on her first MS drug, the drug company that made it would, have us go to these dinners where a physician would be there and presenting on the clinical data behind the drug, right? Now, that physician got paid to do that presentation. That presentation is reportable under the Sunshine Act. And if I went and I looked at that physician and I saw that, what's my takeaway? Am I supposed to say, oh, this drug, maybe my wife shouldn't be on it because the physician who said it was good is getting paid by the pharmaceutical company, right? And so it's confusing as to how the patient is even supposed to interpret the information, because when you go to those talks, they're presenting clinical data from clinical trials, right? It's not just the PI's opinion that is being talked about. And so I found those events to be beneficial, and not something that I would want to hold against my physician when I was making a choice. So I think you're probably dead on. And I think, not only are patients not using it, but when they do interact with the information, it's confusing what the takeaway for them should be.
I would take it one step further. Is it actually having a perverse incentive in that, oh, I'm a doctor. Dr. Smith is now sort of showing up as receiving these payments, and he is participating in these clinical trials. I want to ask my medical affairs professional, my sales rep, how do I get involved in more clinical trials? Because I want to get that money as well. I don't know any doctors who've explicitly said that they do this, but I would be surprised if they don't, because the information is so readily available. Are you seeing any of that perverse incentivizing going on?
I have not, but an entrepreneurial physician could very well do that. And how do I feel about that? I don't know, because we kind of do that in all walks of life, where somebody in our profession is figured out a side hustle, and we say, whoa, what's going on over there? Maybe I can do that side hustle too, So I can't begrudge them too much, because if the information's out there, it's kind of human nature to check on how your peers are making their cheddar, so to speak.
Making their cheddar. So what we're discussing is the impact of the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. We're talking a little bit about the perverse incentives it's caused. But let's go back to the original question we were asking. The original question we were asking was, how does this impact clinical trial negotiation? And in your experience now, we sort of, at this point, sponsors, CROs, sites have stock language you just put in. Something as simple as, we all agree to comply with the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. I mean, there's more complex language, but it basically says that. Is there more to it? Should there be more put in? Should there be, the entire goal of this was transparency. Should there be more types of transparency, or should there be something more that we should have done or should do that is not already incorporated?
I would actually look at it from a slightly different perspective, because in the beginning, when the law rolled out, the language was more complicated, and the language created reporting obligations on the site to the pharma about, payments that are made applicable to, that are on, reportable under the Sunshine Act. And what the site's position is, we shouldn't have to report anything to you. You know the entity that you're paying, and you know what you're paying them for, and you know how much you're paying. So there should be nothing that we need to report back to you. And so there was a lot of argument about that in the beginning. And I think eventually the pharmas realized, there's really nothing for the sites to report back to us, because we do know who we're paying and for what, and who the PI is and all this information. And so now the language just says, we'll both comply, and if the sponsor needs information, we'll reasonably provide it so that they can report it to CMS. So I actually, think it's become one of those things where it's like, we'll comply with applicable law. Yes, we'll comply with applicable law. So it's become just that type of conversation now, which I think is the right conversation to be had at this point.
Which brings us to that next point, right? And so far, we've given a lot of grief to the lawmakers for coming up with a law that may not have achieved the goals. But now let's be a little bit more deferential and play out that version of facts. The truth is that a lot of physician agreements, employment agreements, or consulting agreements, depending on how it's set up, do have incentive payments associated with them. And those incentive payments do include clauses that will say something like, if you bring in X amount of money, we will give you Y amount of money as a result of it. So there'll be some kind of addendum or some kind of clause that gives you a bump for bringing in money to the hospital. This obviously has kickback concerns. This obviously has issues of, is this in the best interest of the patients? Those are the thoughts that go through people's heads. Why are sites more hesitant to share that information? Isn't that in the end beneficial for people in general?
Yeah, I mean, you would think so, and you can see from the employer's perspective, there's no real advantage to sharing that information. I think as a site, you have to be really careful, because you can't incentivize enrollment into trials, right? Like that cannot be a thing that you're doing in those agreements or any structure you have with your physicians. So you have to be very careful how you structure those, because we know that if in your clinical trial agreement there's any type of enrollment incentive, what you're saying as a site is no, get that away, as far away from me as you can. So it's a great point, and you could see why the employer is not motivated to make it public, but they better be very careful, because there's definitely laws against incentivizing enrollment into clinical trials.
So should there be, and I've never seen this done, to be honest, but should there be an audit provision in agreements that says we as the pharma company reserve the right to come in, audit your employment agreements? I can just see the havoc this would cause. But theoretically, should there be this idea, this clause that says we reserve the right to come in, audit your employment agreements to make sure that there is no pass-through liability to us as a result of you incentivizing your physicians to participate or your patients to participate in clinical research that may result in inappropriate payments being made to physicians and or to patients?
I mean, you could argue there's some logic there, but then if I'm a site, I would say, show me your incentive structures for your salespeople who are interacting with my physicians and trying to get them to prescribe the drugs, right? That would be, if we're going to put our cards on the table, let's both put our cards on the table. But I mean, I hear what you're saying. I just think that would be a very difficult thing from a political perspective. And I don't mean, like government political. Right. I mean, like from a office politics perspective, to make that kind of information available. So I hear what you're saying. I just don't see that being a thing that happens.
I actually have to agree with you, but I think we're needling this topic a little bit just to see what pops out. But it's an interesting idea, right? Should companies put their own incentive agreements in play so that, and maybe it doesn't have to be on a, in fact, let's play this out a little bit. Pharma companies above a certain payment value, if you will, have to put up a example of their incentivized payment structures on Edgar or the SEC website, so you can go and look at how they incentivize payments. On the other hand, physicians have to go ahead and, well, not physicians, but sites have to go ahead and disclose how they incentivize physicians. If you're a publicly traded company, it raises this whole new level of transparency, raises the question again, to what end, for what value? Because there's been my experience has not been that DOJ is going in and saying that there is a transfer of liability for something that that a site is doing in the context of a clinical trial that should be attributed to the physician. But it's not a super novel thought process that cannot be done in the future. And I feel like I feel like the DOJ is going to look at this and go, why haven't we not thought of this? Because theoretically, the argument is that you are supposed to be looking at how your vendors operate.
That's a good point. And now that, as you were talking there, and we were talking about the entrepreneurial PI regarding the Sunshine Act, if you had this information public, then you could see people doing like, the employee doing employer shopping, meaning I'm a physician at this hospital. This is what my incentive structure is, but look at this incentive structure at this other hospital. Or if I'm a medical device salesperson, I say, oh, wow, look at, what this other pharma is doing for their salespeople. So I think, a tangential to this is, I think it would be like employee empowerment if all of those things were made available to people so they could see what, different folks were doing.
So I don't know if you follow Dan Safara or Brad Hightower. Do you know who they are?
No.
Okay. So these guys they're podcasters, but they also own their own clinical trial sites. And yesterday, before, they were talking about they also post significantly on LinkedIn. And I want to say Brad put this out there, and he tagged me in it, which is why I kind of know about this. But Brad put out this idea that, what would be really great if we all start disclosing what we charge for, what's the word I'm looking for a blood glucose test or for a whatever. And the immediate obvious result was you get transparency, but you also possibly look at price fixing. And that becomes two sides of the same coin. The moment you start disclosing incentives and the moment you start disclosing how you pay these physicians, do you land up in the same structure, the same problem, which is you now land up with, here's what FMV is, here's what fair market value for physicians is. You should not be paying over that. And if you are, you're opening yourself up to liability. And or if you keep them within that band too narrowly, you're now involved in sort of what's the word I was talking about? Non-competition, or preventing people from competing and getting better jobs. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a risk that you would run if you did it that way, for sure. And I think any compliance program based on ethical considerations like this, there's these kind of trade-offs that you're talking about, right? There's always kind of a double-edged sword in terms of it's not going to be perfect, right? And there's going to be those trade-offs, because you could, one side of the coin, you talk about price fixing, but on the other side of the coin, if these prices were made public, then you're also talking about price competition in terms of that I'm a patient now, and I can, that's what, as a patient, what have we been asking for years? That we could just know how much stuff costs. Like that if I go and get my knee scoped over here, it's going to cost me X amount of dollars, right? And so, you could kind of see it impacting both sides of that coin in terms of, the stuff you're talking about, but also a competition on prices potentially.
But it raises this question of, if you're disclosing payments made to physicians by sites, payments made to physicians by sponsors or by CROs, does it really tell you? Does it give you any impact, any information on what your procedure will cost? Because it's
no.
So then what's the point?
I thought you meant making things like blood glucose prices public, right? So prices is what I was referring to.
Okay. So he was talking about in the context of blood glucose prices or procedure prices. I was saying, if you're going to disclose that, why don't you also just as easily disclose physician payments? Because then you can do the exact same thing. Price fix doctors' salaries, which can have its own repercussions, is my point.
And so a lot of states just passed laws where, as part of a job that you put out there, you have to put what the salary is going to be. Right now, a lot of companies, what they've done is they've put obscenely broad salary ranges, right? So it doesn't really give you any information. But that's kind of the same kind of logic, right? Is to get that information out there. And so, it's not exactly the same, because that's a job that you're applying to. And here you're looking at what your doctor is doing. But you can see kind of the same kind of trade-offs. Is the employer making that information public is disadvantageous to them, right? It's the same reason that an employer, they don't want their people talking to each other about their salaries. And this is kind of unique to the United States, but we're very hush-hush here about how much money everybody makes. And so from, you can see the pushback from the employer perspective that we don't want that. We don't want that out there, so that our competitors can know, how we're paying our physicians. So I don't know, Darshan. I mean, it's a good question, and I don't think it's a perfect solution, but you can definitely see the logic behind doing it.
Yeah. We can obviously keep talking about this a lot more, Ish, but this was a great conversation. We talked a lot about the Sunshine Act. We talked a lot about whether it makes sense. And what gets disclosed, the fact that it is any transfer of value. I do want to add, because it didn't come up in conversation, the last time I checked, it was anything over $10 in value in an individual transaction, or $100 in aggregate over the course of the year. Do you know if those numbers have been updated, by the way? I haven't checked.
I don't know. But the thing about it is clinical trials is like the smallest part of the Sunshine Act, right? What they really wanted to be disclosing is when they're getting those speaker fees, and they're on getting paid to be on the protocol writing committee, and this kind of stuff. So I don't know if the limits have changed, but I feel like I would know if the limits had changed, right? So the fact that it's not something I'm aware of leads me to probably believe that they haven't.
My only thought process, I think they were tied to inflation, is my recollection.
Oh, are they? Okay.
That's my recollection, going back 10 years at this point. But that's why I also don't think that it would really strike us, because, oh my God, in the last 10 years, that became $15 a transaction. Like, okay, that's not really changing how we operate. So it may not have popped out to us. But I think it's an interesting sort of piece to discuss. We do have to have you back because there are so many more conversations to have. But Ish, thank you again for coming on. Before we go, if people have questions, how can they reach you?
They can just shoot me an email, ifekete@hcg.com.
Awesome. Ish, pleasure talking to you as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Darshan.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Darshan Talks. Remember, the information we discuss is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. For additional valuable insights and updates, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at DarshanTalks.com. Darshan Talks is powered by the Kulkarni